Clara Whitmore had 40 minutes. That's how long the drive to the hospice took. And that's how long the nurse said her mother had left. She was 28. She taught 11 kids in an inclusion classroom at a school the district kept forgetting to fund. And she'd just been warned that if she walked out of that building, her contract wouldn't be renewed. She walked out anyway. Then, 4 blocks from the highway, a car clipped a young woman crossing Atwells Avenue and didn't stop. People shouted. Phones came up. Nobody stepped into the road. Clara looked at the girl lying on the asphalt, and she looked at the clock on her dashboard, and she understood exactly what this was going to cost her. She got out of the car. The girl couldn't remember her own name. She grabbed Clara's wrist and said, "Please don't go." And Clara stayed. And while she was kneeling in the middle of that street beside a stranger, her mother was dying alone 11 miles away. Clara didn't know who that girl was. She didn't know that 2 days later, a man whose name people in this city lowered their voices to say would be parked outside her building at midnight, holding a folder with her whole life inside it, trying to work out what she wanted. Because in his world, nobody stops for free. Everybody has a price, and he'd never once been wrong about that. If this story moves you, please give it a like and share it with someone who's ever paid for doing the right thing. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to that Tuesday morning, and to the 40 minutes that changed everything. The third-floor apartment sat at the end of a row of old buildings on the south side of the city, where every wooden stair creaked differently, and Clara had memorized which ones needed a lighter step. It wasn't fully daylight yet when she woke, and the first thing she did wasn't make coffee. She opened her phone and found the old recording, the one she had listened to so many times that she knew even the places where her mother paused to catch her breath. It was the last recording in which her mother had still been able to speak in complete sentences, before her voice began breaking apart into fragments, and the nurses had to guess more than they could hear. In that recording, her mother said, "Don't leave your class because of me, sweetheart. I have people here to take care of me, but those children don't have anyone else." Then she coughed once. Then she laughed, and that laugh was the thing Clara feared most, because it was the only part of the recording that didn't sound like someone who was dying. Clara listened all the way through, then turned off the phone and sat on the edge of the bed for a little while longer, like someone who had just set down something too heavy and needed to wait for her hands to stop trembling. On the refrigerator door, an envelope was held in place by a faded orange-shaped magnet. Clara pulled it down, counted the money, then counted it again, not because she doubted the first count, but because she hoped the second one might somehow produce a different number. It didn't. The rent was due at the end of the week. Her mother's medication was due before that. And between those two deadlines was a space Clara had been living inside for years. The space people who had never lacked money liked to call by beautiful names such as resilience or strength, while people who had lived through it simply called it this month. She tucked the envelope back where it had been, put on her coat, and before fastening it, she took a handkerchief from the drawer, folded it into quarters, and slipped it into her breast pocket. It was linen, with a white letter E embroidered in one corner, the stitches so small and even that you had to look closely to see they were stitches, and not a printed line. Her mother had given it to her on the day she was admitted, without saying much, only telling her to take it, that she had embroidered it back when her hands still didn't shake, and Clara should carry it so all that work wouldn't feel wasted. Clara had never used it. She only carried it with her. Her phone vibrated just as she reached the bottom stair. The screen showed the name St. Bede Nursing Home, and Clara knew before she answered that no one called at this hour with any other kind of news. The nurse on the other end spoke gently and slowly, the particular kind of slowness of someone who had delivered this message many times and still had never found a way to make it hurt less. She said Clara's mother had stopped eating the night before, that her blood pressure had fallen, and that if Clara wanted to come, she should come now. She didn't say a word about how much time was left. She only said now, and that word was enough. The school was about a 15-minute drive away, and Clara was there before she had even decided what she was going there to do, whether to ask for the day off, say goodbye to the children, or simply give herself a few more minutes in which she didn't have to think. The vice principal's office was on the ground floor, the door open, and Marlene Pike looked up before Clara even knocked. She listened to everything without interrupting once, then pulled out the attendance ledger and opened it directly to the page she needed without searching, which meant she had already opened that page before Clara arrived. She wasn't cruel. Her voice sounded more tired than hard. She said there was no one who could cover Clara's class, that the district didn't provide substitute teachers for temporary contracts, that the previous time and the time before that she had taught the class herself, and she couldn't do it again today. She said next year's contract would go up for approval the following month, and what was written in this ledger would be part of that file. And if Clara walked out the door, Marlene wouldn't be able to sign for her anymore. Clara asked whether she was threatening her. Marlene closed the ledger, rested one hand on the cover, and said, "I'm not threatening you. I'm only reading the arithmetic back to you." Clara stood there for a moment. Through the small pane of glass in the classroom door across the hallway, she could see the children arranging their chairs into a circle exactly the way she had taught them at the beginning of the year, every child moving slowly, every child managing it on their own. Then she turned back to Marlene, said thank you, and walked out. Marlene didn't call after her. She remained by the window for a very long time. The pavement still held the heat of the morning, and Clara felt it seep through her knees the instant they touched the ground. A man nearby had already bent down and slipped his hands beneath the girl's shoulders, trying to lift her, and Clara heard her own voice come out before she had time to think, saying, Don't move her. Leave her exactly where she is." The man pulled his hands back. Clara placed both hands on either side of the girl's head, keeping it aligned with the rest of her body, and she held it there with exactly the amount of pressure they had taught during the mandatory first aid training she had once attended in the school board room on some August afternoon, the session where nearly everyone else had brought papers to grade so they could pass the time. Clara hadn't. She had listened. She had taken notes. And the instructor that day had said something she never forgot, that the most dangerous thing at an emergency scene wasn't always the injury, but well-meaning people doing the wrong thing. Now she was there, and she knew exactly what she was allowed to do. She looked up and searched the circle of people around them until she found two faces that seemed to be waiting for someone to tell them what to do. Then she pointed to a woman in a restaurant uniform and a young man wearing a backpack. She didn't ask whether they were willing. She told the woman to go to one end, stand outside the lane, raise her hands, and stop any car from turning in. She told the young man to go to the other end and do the same. Both moved immediately, and Clara recognized something she had learned long ago in her classroom, that people didn't stand still because they were cold or indifferent. They stood still because no one had told them what to do. She pulled the handkerchief from her breast pocket, unfolded the fabric, and pressed it against the place on the girl's arm that was bleeding. She pressed with the flat of her palm, steady and firm, and didn't lift it to see whether the bleeding had slowed, because lifting it would ruin what she was doing. Within only a few breaths, she could feel the linen growing warm beneath her hand. She didn't look down. She looked at the girl's face. The girl's eyes opened, then closed, then opened again. And every time they opened, they drifted in a different direction, like someone waking in a strange room and not yet knowing where the door was. Clara began to speak, and she used the same voice she used in her classroom, the voice it had taken her first 2 years of teaching to learn. Slow, even, without rises or falls, without adding anything unnecessary, and only one sentence, repeated again and again, until the person hearing it could hold on. "I'm here. Look at me. I'm here." The girl managed to meet her eyes for a moment, then drifted away again, and Clara started over. "I'm here. Look at me. I'm here." No faster, no louder. Exactly the same way she would sit beside a child losing all sense of direction during a fire drill, when every explanation had become useless, and the only thing that still worked was a short sentence repeated enough times to become something to hold on to. The girl's lips moved. She asked whether she had fallen. Clara said yes. "You fell. The ambulance is coming." The girl asked the same question twice more, and both times Clara gave her exactly the same answer, without impatience, without changing a single word. Then she asked the girl her name. The girl was silent for a long time, blinking slowly, then said, "I don't remember." She said it calmly, and it was that calmness, not the answer itself, that sent a chill through Clara. The girl added, "I was going somewhere. I have to go somewhere. I'm late." Clara asked where. The girl couldn't answer. Her purse lay some distance away with its mouth fallen open, and the woman in the restaurant uniform picked it up and brought it over. There was no wallet inside, no identification, no cards of any kind, only keys, a pen, and a small rectangular plastic box containing a clear amber-colored piece that had been worn hollow on one side. Clara picked it up, looked at it for 1 second, then placed it back inside the purse and closed the bag. She told the girl, "Your things are right here. I'll keep them safe for you." Then she placed her other hand on the girl's shoulder, pressed more firmly over the wound, and began again from the beginning. "I'm here. Look at me. I'm here." In the distance, the sound of an ambulance siren began growing louder from the direction of the hospital, and Clara heard it, but she didn't turn her head. She didn't take her eyes off the girl even once. The paramedics took over where Clara had been holding the girl, and she withdrew her hands to the rhythm of their count, slowly, without any sudden movement, then sat back on her heels and couldn't make herself stand right away. The handkerchief remained in someone else's hands. She thought about going back to her car, and she had managed to rise halfway when a uniformed police officer came over and asked whether she had been the first person to step into the road, and that question kept her there longer than everything that had happened before it. He explained that the car had left the scene, that this was a hit-and-run case, and that apart from her, no one had been standing close enough to say anything useful. The people who had recorded video had only captured what came afterward. The crowd, Clara kneeling in the middle of the road. No one had recorded what happened before. Clara gave her statement. She gave it slowly, in order, without adding opinions, and she heard how calm her own voice sounded and found it strange herself. Then they asked whether she could ride with the ambulance, because the girl had no identification, couldn't remember her name, and the hospital would need someone who could explain what she had been like in those first few minutes. Clara looked toward her car parked at an angle across the road, the door still open, the key still in the ignition. She asked the officer to lock it for her, then climbed into the ambulance. In the emergency department, everything slowed down in a way completely different from the street. Outside, everything moved quickly because someone might die. In here, everything moved slowly because there were forms. An intake clerk asked for the patient's name, and Clara said she didn't know. Asked her age, Clara said she didn't know. Allergies, current medications, emergency contact. And every time Clara said she didn't know, the clerk typed another line, and finally asked what Clara was to the patient. Clara said, "I was just passing by." The clerk stopped typing, looked at her for a second, then continued, and in the contact field entered Clara Whitmore's name and phone number. Not because anyone trusted her, only because the field couldn't be left blank. She sat down in the row of plastic chairs along the hallway and stayed there. Not because of kindness, not because anyone was keeping her there, but because the system had written her name into a space, and now wasn't ready to let that name leave. The clock on the wall across from her kept moving. At one point, Clara stood and walked toward the exit, then turned around and sat back down, because every time she got up, someone in a white coat passed by and asked another question about those first 10 minutes, whether the girl had vomited, whether she had been able to speak, whether she had kept her eyes closed for long. And Clara answered every question carefully and accurately, because she knew those answers were useful. They were useful to one person. They were not useful to her mother. Then came the sound of running footsteps at the far end of the hallway, and a woman a few years younger than Clara rushed to the desk, her voice breaking as she asked for someone by name, and the intake clerk looked up and nodded. They took the woman inside. Clara watched until the door closed behind her, then stood, walked to the end of the hallway, where there was a window, and took out her phone. She called St. Bede Nursing Home. The phone rang 3 times. The person who answered introduced herself as Odette Ramsey, and Clara recognized her voice. She was the day shift nurse Clara often saw when she visited in the mornings. Odette asked where she was. Clara said, "I'm at the hospital. Not where my mother is. I'm at another hospital. I'm coming right now." There was a brief silence on the other end, and when Odette spoke again, her voice had changed. Slower now, more careful. The caution of someone about to say something she didn't want to have to say. She told Clara that her mother was no longer responding. She said, "I'll put the phone to her ear, but I don't want you to hope." Clara stood there with her forehead resting against the window frame and listened to the faint rustling as the phone changed hands. Then there was nothing. She said, "Mom?" She said, "It's me. I'm on my way." She said, "I'm sorry. I got held up. Something happened in the street and I couldn't leave." "I'm sorry, Mom." She said, "Wait for me just a little longer. I'm almost there." She said, "I love you." She said those things into a telephone when she was almost certain there was no one left who could hear them, and she knew she was speaking for herself, and she kept speaking anyway. Then she ended the call. She walked the entire length of the hallway, went through the doors, and started running. Her car was still where she had left it on Atwells Avenue, carefully locked just as the police officer had promised, and Clara took a taxi back to get it, then drove the rest of the distance she should have traveled that morning. St. Bede Nursing Home stood behind a row of maple trees, and there were still plenty of empty spaces in the parking lot that day. She walked past the reception desk, and no one stopped her. The second-floor hallway still smelled of floor disinfectant and porridge. Her mother's door was partly closed. Clara pushed it open. The bed had already been made. Fresh sheets, the pillow squared neatly, the rail on the left lowered. On the small bedside cabinet, the plastic cup with the yellow handle was still sitting exactly where it had always been. And beside it was the horn comb her mother had brought from home. the same comb she had been using since before Clara was old enough to go to school. No one had gotten around to clearing those two things away yet. Her mother lay on a stretcher beside the wall, covered with a white sheet up to her chest. Clara walked over, stood there for a moment, then reached down and straightened the collar of her mother's nightgown, folding back the left side where the fabric had turned inward, smoothing the edge flat, exactly as she had done every time she visited, exactly as her hands had done hundreds of times, without needing her mind to tell them how. When she finished, she stood upright again with both arms resting at her sides. She didn't cry. Odette Ramsey came into the room a little later and stopped at a respectful distance, not moving any closer. She said Clara's mother had gone very gently, without struggling, without fighting for breath, and that she had been in the room when it happened. Clara asked what time. Odette said 9:55. Clara nodded and thanked her. Odette added something about leaving everything in the cabinet exactly where it was until the end of the week, and that the administrative office would contact Clara again that afternoon. Then she left. Clara sat down in the plastic chair beside the bed, the same chair she had been sitting in for months, and she remained there until someone came in and asked whether she had chosen a funeral home yet. She said no. They handed her a printed sheet with 3 names and 3 phone numbers. She took it, folded it in half, and slipped it into her coat pocket. And that pocket was empty because the handkerchief was no longer there. That afternoon she signed several papers. That evening she returned to the 3rd-floor apartment, stepping lightly on exactly the stairs that needed a lighter step, opened the door, and sat down on the edge of the bed in the same place where she had sat that morning. Her phone showed several missed calls from a number she didn't recognize, and a message from the hospital across the city asking whether she could confirm a few more details about the scene. She answered that message first. Then she opened the old recording, the last one in which her mother had still been able to speak in complete sentences, and rested her finger on the screen. But she didn't press play. She turned off the phone, set it down, and lay back without taking off her coat. In the weeks that followed, and for many months after that, many people would ask her the same question in different voices. Some would ask directly. Some would circle around it. Some would ask while pouring tea. Some would ask over the phone close to midnight. They would all ask whether it had been worth it. Not one of them would ask whether she was all right. The administrative office gave Clara until the end of the week to clear out her mother's belongings, and she went on Friday afternoon because she didn't want to do it over the weekend, when the hallways would be crowded with visitors. Her mother's wardrobe was the narrow kind built into the wall, with 4 dresses and 1 light coat hanging inside, and beneath them was a drawer Clara had never opened, because her mother had always said it held nothing but miscellaneous papers. Clara pulled it open. Inside was a pale blue cardboard box, the old-fashioned kind once used for storing files, its corners softened from being opened and closed many times. Clara placed it on the bed and lifted the lid. On top were several old hospital bills, then her birth certificate, then an unmarked brown envelope. She opened the envelope. Inside was a stack of yellowed papers held together by a rusted staple, and the first page was a copy of a city police department report bearing a date Clara knew by heart. The date she had heard described her entire life in a single sentence. "Your father died right away? Sweetheart, he didn't have time to suffer." She read the first line. Then she read the first line again. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and kept reading. The report gave the time of the accident. It gave the time dispatch received the emergency call. Between those 2 times were 26 minutes. Clara read that number 3 times, then turned to the next page looking for something that would tell her she had misunderstood, some technical explanation, that the line had been busy or the ambulance had been delayed. There was nothing. The next page contained witness statements, 4 of them. The first person said he had been driving in the outside lane and had seen someone lying there, but he was already late for work. The second said she thought the person was drunk. The third said he had slowed down, looked, and kept driving. The fourth wrote exactly 1 line by hand, the writing neat and slightly slanted, and Clara read that line and then couldn't read anything else for a long time. "I thought someone else had already called." Behind the police report was a smaller sheet of paper with the letterhead of a law office, a response to a question her mother had apparently sent sometime afterward. The letter was brief and polite. It said there was no legal basis for holding the people who had passed by responsible, that state law imposed no duty to stop, and that she should consider the cost before pursuing the matter any further. In the lower corner of the letter, her mother had written 2 words in pencil, the marks so faint Clara had to tilt the page toward the light to read them. The words were "Don't tell." Clara sat for a very long time with the papers resting in her lap. She understood then, slowly and completely, that the woman lying in a funeral home across the city had kept that envelope for nearly 20 years, had read those words more times than Clara could ever guess, and had decided that her daughter would never know, not to protect anyone's reputation, not out of shame, but because if Clara knew, then Clara would grow up understanding that people could pass a dying person in the street and keep going, and her mother hadn't wanted her daughter to carry that knowledge into the world. She had chosen to raise a child who believed in other people, instead of a child who knew the truth. She had paid that price alone. Clara folded the papers, rested them on her knees, and spoke aloud into the empty room, speaking to someone who was no longer there. She said, "Mom, you hid this from me so I wouldn't be afraid of people." Then she said, "But Mom, I still turned out this way." She sat there a little longer. Then, she placed the papers back inside the envelope, put the envelope back into the box, and instead of burying the box at the bottom of the bag of belongings as she had first intended, she tucked it beneath her arm, carried it out to the car, and placed it on the front passenger seat beside her. The night of the accident, at the hospital across the city, the surgical floor was cleared before anyone had time to ask why. 2 patients waiting for surgery that night were moved to other rooms. An orthopedic surgeon who had been asleep in Boston was awakened and arrived before dawn, and no one in the department asked how he had gotten there or who had paid for the trip. The hospital security guards, men who were normally used to blocking doors and asking for identification, stepped all the way back to the far end of the hallway this time, and stood facing the wall, as though looking directly ahead had become something they weren't permitted to do. The finance office sent no forms upstairs. When Emiliano Milo Rocca stepped out of the elevator, 2 nurses who had been talking fell silent, not because they knew who he was, but because they saw the way everyone else in the hallway changed the way they stood as he passed. He didn't raise his voice. He asked the physician on duty one question, listened to the answer, then sat down in the chair outside the recovery room and didn't get up again. Close to 4 o'clock in the morning, Bruno Salvi arrived. He remained standing and gave his report in the same brief manner he always did. He said the police had confirmed that the car had left the scene. He said Julia's purse was still intact, and nothing had been taken. Then he came to the part he had deliberately saved for last, that a woman had stepped into the road, held the girl still, told people to block both ends of the street, and sat there on the pavement for 40 minutes until the ambulance arrived, then rode with her to the hospital, gave a statement to the police, and left without leaving anything behind. Milo asked what she had left. Bruno said nothing. No bank account number, no message, no request for anyone to contact her, no return visit, only a name and phone number in the contact field, because the hospital required something to be entered there. Milo was silent longer than Bruno was accustomed to. Then he said, "Nobody does anything for free, Bruno. They just haven't told you the price yet." He said, "Find out what hers is." 2 days later, close to midnight, his car was parked in front of an old row of buildings on the south side of the city, across from a 3-story building with wooden stairs and a single window on the top floor, still glowing with light. Bruno sat in the front seat, placed the file on the seat beside Milo, then got out and stood on the sidewalk smoking. Milo opened the file and read beneath the small light in the ceiling of the car. No gambling debts, no criminal record, no active social media accounts. 1 student loan still unpaid, with regular payments made on the same day every month. 3 jobs over the past several years, all temporary contracts, all ending because the contracts expired, and for no other reason. No man's name anywhere in the file, no unusual spending. Milo turned another page and found a stack of papers that took him a moment to understand. They were letters parents had sent to the school over the years, copied from her personnel file, and every one of them was about the same person. Some were handwritten, some typed, some written on the back of receipts. One mother wrote that her son had refused to walk through the school gates for an entire semester, and Miss Whitmore was the only reason he had finally agreed to go inside. One father wrote that he didn't know how to thank her, that his daughter now arranged her own chair by herself. Milo read the entire stack of letters, more slowly than he read contracts. Then he turned to the final section, the part Bruno had saved for last as he always did, and read a line stating that on the morning of the accident, Clara Whitmore's mother had died at St. Bede Nursing Home at 9:55. Milo read the line, then he read it again. He closed the file and placed it on the seat. Bruno finished his cigarette, turned back toward the car, and when he saw that Milo wasn't signaling anything, he remained standing outside. Milo didn't get out. He sat in the car looking up at the 3rd-floor window, and he stayed there until the light went out, then remained there for a while longer after it had gone dark. The following morning, the hospital returned Julia's personal belongings. Inside the bag, Among a few miscellaneous things in the small plastic box containing rosin, there was a folded piece of linen, dried stiff and darkened through the middle, and in one corner, the white stitches were still intact, forming a single letter. The funeral was held on a weekday morning, using the least expensive package from the 3 names printed on the sheet the nursing home had given her. Not many people came. There were a few old neighbors, 2 women who had sewn with her mother, and Naomi Frank, the only colleague from the school who came, standing at the end of the line and saying nothing through the entire service, except to ask whether Clara needed a ride home. Much later, Naomi would be the one who went from school to school across the district asking contract teachers for signatures. But that was still far in the future. The bills began arriving in the second week. The hospital sent 1 packet, the nursing home sent another, and there was a third from a patient transportation service Clara didn't even remember using. She sat at the kitchen table and added everything together. When she finished, she picked up the sheet, looked at the number on the final line, then set it back down. She couldn't even read the whole amount in one pass. She had to break it apart, read the part before the comma first, then the part after it, and even then the number refused to settle inside her mind. Her mother's insurance had stopped covering its share several months earlier, and Clara had known that, and she had signed the form agreeing to pay the rest herself, signing with the thought that she would figure it out when the time came. Now the time had come. The school district email arrived on a Thursday afternoon with no unusual subject line, only a notice regarding temporary employment contracts. The message was short and standard, thanking her for her service and informing her that her contract for the next school year would not be renewed, effective at the end of the current school year. At the bottom, the electronic signature carried Marlene Pike's name. Clara read the email in her car, parked in the school lot, and when she finished, she closed the phone, started the engine, and drove home. She didn't write a reply. 3 days later, her landlord sent a message saying the rent would increase, beginning the following month, and he apologized. And at the bottom of the message, he added a note of condolence, the words sitting directly beneath the new amount. The pale blue cardboard box had remained on the front passenger seat of her car since the day she carried it out of the nursing home. Clara didn't bring it inside until that weekend, when she emptied everything onto the table. Beneath the papers she had already gone through was another envelope, this one thick and sealed, and across the front her mother had written in blue ink, in handwriting as neat as a student's notebook, Clara's graduate school tuition. Clara held it for a long time before opening it. Inside was nothing but small bills, old bills, folded into little bundles held with rubber bands, along with several slips of paper bearing dates written in pencil. Each amount listed separately, each one the payment for hemming a pair of pants, taking in a blouse, replacing the zipper on a coat. Some of the amounts were so small Clara had to look twice. Her mother had saved that way for years, a little at a time, and had never mentioned it once, not even during the months when there hadn't been enough money to pay the electric bill. Clara sat on the kitchen floor with the open envelope in her lap. She began to laugh. She laughed at the thought that now she was going to take this money and give it to the very hospital that had treated the woman who had saved it. She laughed because the circle was so complete, so perfectly closed, that if someone else had told her the story, she wouldn't have believed it. She laughed for quite a while. Then she cried. On Monday morning, she took the envelope in and made the payment, and when the cashier finished counting the money, she asked whether Clara wanted to keep a paper receipt. Clara said yes. The money covered part of what was owed. The rest remained exactly where it had been. Clara began sending applications everywhere, and she learned very quickly that a person with a master's degree in education, whose contract had just been terminated in the middle of the year, looked, to every human resources office, like a question mark no one wanted to spend time answering. She lowered her standards, then lowered them again. Eventually she applied at a package sorting center on the west side of the city. Night shift, hourly pay. The man who interviewed her was Ruben Ortiz, the shift supervisor, and the interview lasted about 3 minutes. He looked at her resume, looked up at her, then looked down again. He said, "You have a master's degree, and you want to spend your nights putting labels on boxes." Clara said, "Degrees don't pay rent." Ruben nodded and said, "No one here calls me sir or teacher or anything like that. Just call me Ruben, and don't drop any box marked fragile, because every time somebody drops one, I have to sit down and write a report, and I hate writing reports more than I hate anything else in this world." He handed her the form. She started work the following night. Milo's uncle by marriage was named Sal Turini, and he came in the middle of the afternoon because Milo had asked him to come in the middle of the afternoon. There was already a pot of coffee on the table with 2 cups, and when Sal sat down, Milo poured it himself, filling his uncle's cup before his own. and he even asked whether Sal wanted sugar, the way he had been asking since before he was old enough to shave. He asked about Sal's wife, asked whether she had undergone the eye surgery yet, asked whether the doctors there were good. He asked about Sal's 2 children, asked whether the older boy had settled into his new job, asked when the younger girl was graduating. He asked those questions in exactly the voice a nephew uses with an uncle, without the slightest trace of mockery, and Sal answered each one, every answer shorter than the one before. He never touched the coffee. Milo asked about the house too, asked whether the roof had started leaking again, and Sal said no. Then Milo set down his cup, and he didn't ask anything else. He opened the desk drawer, took out 3 sheets of paper, and placed them in front of his uncle, one at a time, without sliding or shoving them across, simply setting each one down and straightening it carefully. The first was the transfer agreement for the auto repair shop on the east side of the city, the shop that stood in Sal's name but had been purchased with family money. The second was notice terminating the lease on the house where Sal and his wife were living, a house rented from a company Milo owned. The third was a pair of one-way airline tickets to Florida in their names, with departure scheduled for the following day. Sal looked down at those 3 papers for a very long time. He didn't ask why. That was the only thing that afternoon that made Milo let out a breath. The fact that his uncle didn't ask why. Sal looked up and said he has 3 little children. He told me he was only asking what time the girl got out of class. He told me it was nothing. Milo said, I know. Sal said, I didn't take a single cent. Milo said, I know. Then Sal said, but you're taking everything from me. Milo shook his head slowly and said, I'm not taking anything from you. I'm only taking back what I once gave you. His uncle sat in silence. He was the man who had carried Milo when Milo was still too young to walk, and both men in the room knew it, and neither one said it aloud. Sal stood. He picked up the 3 papers, folded them, slipped them into the inside pocket of his coat, and walked toward the door. At the door he stopped, turned back, and looked as though he meant to say something. Milo looked at him. Sal said nothing. He left. No one touched anyone. No one raised his voice even once. The door closed very softly, because its hinges had been oiled the week before. Bruno Salvi came in about a minute later. He looked at the untouched cup of coffee on the other side of the table. The heat long gone. A thin film settled across the surface. He asked, Are you all right? Milo said no. Then he said, But if I let him keep one thing, even one thing, next week 10 people will try me. Bruno nodded and said nothing more. He carried the cup away. Late that afternoon, the family's lawyer called, and he called twice within the span of an hour, something he had never done before. The first time, he reported that the Bocci side had filed a civil suit in state court against the Rocca family's port transportation company over a dispute involving a dock lease, and he said the complaint had been written by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, because it wasn't designed to win. It was designed to force the court to allow the plaintiffs access to the books. The second time, he called back, and his voice had changed. He said the federal prosecutor's office had just issued a subpoena demanding all shipping manifests and expense ledgers from the company going back several years, and he said a subpoena like this didn't appear out of nowhere. Someone had given them something specific enough to convince a judge to sign it. Milo listened to everything without interrupting, and when the lawyer stopped speaking, he asked exactly one question, whether the 2 matters were connected. The lawyer was silent for a while, then said, I wouldn't go so far as to say they are. Milo said, then they are. He ended the call, stood, and went to the window, looking down at the harbor below where the cranes were loading cargo through the night. For the first time since the day his father died, he stood in that room knowing with complete certainty that he was losing. He came one afternoon, not at night, and that was the first thing Clara noticed, because she had only been home from the night shift for a few hours and her hair was still wet. She looked through the crack in the door and saw a man standing straight outside, empty-handed, and behind him, about half a flight of stairs away, 2 other men stood perfectly still. He didn't knock a second time. He waited. When Clara opened the door, he didn't step inside immediately. He gave his name, said he was the brother of the girl who had been injured on Atwell's Avenue, and asked permission to come in and speak with her for a few minutes. He said it with the precise courtesy of a man who knew he could enter whenever he wanted, and was choosing to ask first. And it was that courtesy that sent a chill down Clara's spine. She stepped back. He came inside, looked around once very quickly, then stopped looking, and remained standing until she invited him to sit. He thanked her for what she had done that morning. He said the doctor had told him that if anyone had tried to pull his sister up, everything might have turned out differently. He said he had read her statement at the police station. Clara said she hoped the girl was doing better. He said she was. Thank you. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat, took out a check that had already been filled in, placed it on the table, and turned it so Clara could read it properly. She didn't pick it up. She only lowered her eyes, and the amount written there was larger than everything she still owed combined. Larger even than the number she had once needed to divide into 2 parts, just to make herself read it. She sat quietly for a moment. Then she asked what he did for a living. He said transportation. Clara looked toward the door, where through the narrow opening she could still see the shoulder of one of the men standing in the hallway. She asked why a man in transportation needed 2 people standing outside her door. He didn't answer that. He said she should keep the check, and if the amount wasn't enough, she could tell him. Clara pushed the paper back toward him with 2 fingers. Not hard. She said, "I can't take it." He asked why. She said, "Because I didn't do what I did for money." He nodded as though he had expected that answer and said, "Of course not. That's exactly why I'm here." Clara looked at him and realized that he didn't understand, that he was hearing her words as something entirely different, that in his mind, her answer was only the opening move in a negotiation, rather than an answer at all. She said it again, more slowly. She said, "You think I've calculated this wrong. I haven't calculated anything. Your sister couldn't even remember her own name. She was holding my hand and didn't know where she was. If I take this, then that morning becomes a transaction, and I already paid for it with my mother. Don't put a price on that place." The room was silent for a while. Milo looked at her, and she saw no confusion on his face, only something else, something like a man rearranging numbers in his head. He took out a pen, crossed out the old amount, wrote a new one above it, signed again, and placed the check on the table a second time. He said she could think about it, that she didn't have to answer today. Clara stood. She walked to the door, opened it, and remained there with one hand resting on the knob. She didn't tell him to leave. She simply stood that way. Milo sat for a few more seconds, then rose as well. He picked up the check, folded it, and put it back into his pocket. At the threshold he stopped and said he wasn't used to being refused. Clara said, "I know." He said, "You make that sound like criticism." Clara said, "No. I said it with sympathy." Milo looked at her for one more second, then walked out. The 2 men in the hallway followed him down the stairs, and the 4th step from the bottom creaked, the same step Clara always avoided. She closed the door, locked it, then stood with her back against it for a while. There was nothing left on the table. Down on the street, inside the car, Bruno asked how it went. Milo looked out through the window and said she still hasn't named her price. Bruno asked what if she doesn't have one. Milo didn't answer. The night shift at the warehouse ended just as the sky was beginning to lighten, and Clara was usually one of the last people out, because she tended to stay behind and finish sorting whatever labels were left. That morning, when she walked through the gate, a young woman was sitting on the concrete step beside the security booth, with 2 crutches propped beside her, and she stood up the moment she saw Clara. Clara didn't recognize her. She only recognized the small plastic box the young woman was holding, the same box Clara had picked up once and then put back into a purse on Atwell's Avenue. The young woman said, "My name is Julia." She said, "I argued with my brother all evening yesterday so he would let me come here." Then she said, "I don't remember your face. I don't remember your name. I don't remember what I said to you either. I only remember a voice saying over and over that you were there. Just that one sentence again and again, and I held on to it." Then she said, "I only came to apologize because that voice cost you so much." Clara stood still. She asked, "Who told you?" Julia said, "My brother didn't tell me anything. He never tells me anything. But I read the hospital papers and found out the rest myself." The 2 of them sat in the breakfast diner across the street, the place that opened at 4 o'clock for night shift workers, with plastic chairs and weak coffee. Julia leaned her crutches against the wall. She said, "My leg is fine. In a few months I should be done with the crutches." Then she placed her left hand on the table, palm facing upward, and said, "But this is the part they still won't promise anything about." The ligaments in her wrist were damaged, and the doctor kept using the word might. It might recover almost completely. It might not recover enough for her to play professionally. She might have to accept that practicing 4 hours a day belonged to the past. She said, "I have played piano since before I could read, and I don't have anything else. Without that, I don't know who I am." Clara didn't say anything, like everything is going to be all right. She sat quietly for a while, then told Julia about one of her students. She said the boy had come into her class when he was 7, after losing his hearing. She said for nearly 2 years he sat at the back of the room and took part in nothing. Not because he couldn't, but because there was only one sentence in his head at the time, that he had lost something, and now he was less than he had been before. She said that sentence was what held him back, not his ears. Then she told Julia that one day the class was doing a rhythm exercise by tapping on the surface of their desks. And the boy was the only one who kept the beat from beginning to end, because he wasn't listening with his ears. He was feeling it through the hand resting on the wood. And that day he was the best one in the room. Clara said it took him 2 years to understand that he hadn't lost everything. He was simply learning another way. She said now the boy was 13 and kept time better than anyone else in the school. Julia looked down at her hand, resting on the plastic tabletop, and said nothing for a long time. Then she asked whether Clara still taught that class. Clara said only until the end of this school year. Julia didn't ask anything more. At noon that day, in the physical therapy room across the city, Julia sat in a chair with a small rubber ball resting in her left palm. The therapist told her, "Squeeze. Hold for 3 counts. Release." She squeezed. 4 fingers closed. Her little finger didn't. She tried again. Still nothing. Milo stood near the doorway with his hands in his pockets and didn't come closer. He remained there through the entire session without saying a word. When the therapist stepped out, Julia let the ball fall into her lap and looked up at her brother. She said, "You brought the best doctor in America here at 2 o'clock in the morning. You cleared an entire hospital floor. You could make that intersection disappear if you wanted to." Then she said, "So, fix my wrist." Milo didn't answer. He stood there, and for the first time in his life, the reflex that had always been ready inside his head, the reflex that immediately searched for who to call, how much to pay, what to trade for what, couldn't find anything to hold on to. There was no one to call. There was no number to write. Julia looked at him and understood it through that silence alone. She bent down, picked up the ball, and set it aside. She said, "Don't come anymore." Milo said something, only one word, and she shook her head. She said, "It isn't because I'm angry with you." Then she said, "Every time you come here, I remember that I was hit because I carry your name." Milo remained in the doorway for a while longer. Then he walked out into the hallway, and Bruno rose from the waiting room chair, looked at his face, and didn't ask a single question. It took Bruno nearly 3 weeks to find the car, and when he came into the office to report, he closed the door behind him, something he rarely did. He said the plates had been removed, and the car abandoned in a scrapyard across the state line. He said the driver was a young man in his 20s with no criminal record, working shifts at a warehouse, and he owed a debt large enough that if he couldn't pay it, his entire family would have to move out. The creditor was someone connected to the Bocci family. Bruno said the young man had been paid to do something very small, not hit anyone. Just drive close. Drive close to the pedestrian at that particular intersection, at that particular time. Scare the person badly enough to send a message home. Bruno said he had even been told to look clearly at the girl's face before passing her, to make sure he had the right person. Milo asked who told him. Bruno said there had been an intermediary, and he had traced the money back 2 levels, and the person at that second level had been on the Bocci payroll for many years. Milo sat in silence. Bruno continued, his voice slowing near the end. He said the kid panicked. He had never done anything like this before. When he got close, his hands locked up. He turned the wheel the wrong way, and everything happened the way it did. Bruno said he didn't stop because at first he didn't even understand what he had just done, and by the time he did, he was already several blocks away. Milo stood and walked to the window. Inside his mind, everything fell into place very quickly and very neatly, with a neatness that was almost cruel. That intersection wasn't somewhere Julia normally walked. That hour wasn't a time when she was usually out. Someone had known her schedule. Someone had sold that schedule. And none of it had really been aimed at his sister. It had been aimed at him. It was a message for him, written across someone else's body. He thought about the harbor, about the lawsuit, about the federal subpoena, and he understood that what had happened that morning on Atwell's Avenue was part of the price of his own life, except he hadn't been the one who paid it. His sister had. And the person who had stayed on the pavement for 40 minutes holding together the consequences was a stranger. A woman who had missed the last morning of her mother's life to do what should have been his responsibility, the thing he should have been there to do, and hadn't been there to do. He stood at the window for a very long time. Then he turned and gave Bruno a name and an address, and Bruno nodded without asking him to repeat it. He had heard that tone before. Julia came that afternoon. She made her way into the office on her crutches and didn't sit down. She said, "I heard." Milo asked, "Who told you?" She said, "No one told me anything. I saw Uncle Bruno's face when he walked out, and I knew." Then she said, "I'm not here to ask what you're planning to do. I'm here to tell you one thing." She said, "I have to live with the memory of you for much longer than you think. If you do what you're thinking of doing, then for the rest of my life, when I think of you, you'll be the man who did that, not the brother who sat outside the recovery room all night." She said, "I don't want to remember you that way." Milo said, "You don't understand what this is." Julia said, "I do understand, and that's exactly why I'm standing here." Then she said, "One more thing. The last thing. They already took one wrist from me. Don't let them take the rest too." She left. Milo remained in the office until the sky had gone completely dark, and no one turned on the lights. The following morning, the family lawyer carried a file to the city police department and submitted it through the proper channels. It contained photographs of the car in the scrapyard, the vehicle identification number, the driver's name, and a record of his movements that morning. The lawyer said nothing beyond what was already in the file. That afternoon, the young man was arrested at his workplace. Bruno came in to report it. Milo listened, nodded once, and said, "Thank you, Uncle Bruno." Bruno remained there for another second, then asked, "Did you change your mind because of the girl?" Milo said, "I changed my mind because she was right." On Tuesday night that week, someone knocked over a pallet in the loading area, and Ruben Ortiz walked past Clara's station while she was labeling boxes, dropped a printed form onto the table, and complained that he hated this thing even more than being called in to work on a Sunday. He said the safety office had sent it back because the previous shift hadn't completed it, and now somebody had to fill in the missing section before the shift ended. He said, "Your handwriting is readable, so fill it out for me. I'm going to look at the forklift." Then he walked away. Clara pulled the paper closer. It was an incident report form divided vertically into 4 sections, each with a bold heading. The first section was direct cause. The second was immediate response. The third was corrective action. The fourth was preventive action. The first 3 had already been completed by the previous shift. The handwriting messy, but the information clear enough. The 4th section was blank. Clara looked at that empty box, and she sat still longer than something so simple required. Then she picked up a pen and filled it in, writing that the maximum stacking height lines in the loading area needed to be repainted and reminder signs posted at the entrance to the aisle. She signed her name, folded the paper, and left it on Ruben's desk. But that empty box wouldn't leave her mind for the rest of the shift. Near dawn, when the conveyor stopped and everyone went outside to smoke, Clara took a blank copy of the form from the stack in the corner of the table, carried it outside, and sat down on the concrete step beside the security booth, the same step where Julia had waited for her the other day. She filled one out for herself. In the first section, direct cause, she wrote that a teacher had to leave school during instructional hours because an immediate family member was dying, and the school had no one available to replace her. In the second section, immediate response, she wrote that the teacher's contract was terminated. In the third section, corrective action, she sat for a very long time, then wrote one word, none. Then she looked down at the 4th section and set the pen aside. The 4th box remained empty. When she got home, she didn't sleep. She opened her computer, went to the school district website, and began reading from the beginning. She read the personnel policies, the appendices, the amendments added year after year, and she read them the way she had always read her students' individualized education plans, line by line, marking every place where the word "if" appeared, every place where the words "except in cases" appeared. Close to noon, she found what she had been looking for, and it was sitting in a perfectly ordinary place. Not hidden at all, simply something no one had read closely enough. A compassionate leave policy existed. It was written clearly. It allowed paid leave when an immediate family member became critically ill or died. It even laid out the application process and named the person authorized to approve it. But in the first line of the provision, immediately after the words "applies to," there were 4 words Clara read again and again until her vision blurred. Permanent teaching staff only. She turned to the definitions section. Temporary contract teachers, substitute teachers, teaching assistants, classroom support staff, all of them were defined separately in another section, and nowhere in that section was there a single line about compassionate leave. It wasn't that they were denied it. It didn't exist for them at all. She opened the district's publicly available staffing statistics and began adding the numbers. The group of employees who had no such provision made up nearly 1/3 of all the people teaching in classrooms across the district. Clara leaned back in her chair. She thought about those thousands of people who went to school every morning without knowing that if one morning their phone rang, they would be forced to choose between 2 things no one should ever have to choose between. She thought about how no one had asked this question in all these years, and she understood why no one had asked. Because the people who found themselves in that position were, at that exact moment, burying someone, paying a debt, looking for another job, and none of them had any strength left to ask anything at all. She reached for the stack of papers on the table, and the one on top was the cremation receipt. She turned it over and wrote the first line on the back. She wrote that no one should have to choose between their children and their dying mother. She read the sentence again, then crossed it out. It was true, but it was a sentence for crying, not a sentence to submit to anyone. She took out a clean sheet of paper, sat up straight, and began again in the same voice she had used for 8 years when preparing documents for her students, a voice with no adjectives in it at all. On the first line, she wrote, "Proposal to extend compassionate leave provisions to non-permanent instructional personnel. To propose anything to the school board, the first thing you had to prove was that no one had ever proposed it before, and Clara knew that because she had read the procedural rules carefully. So she applied for permission to enter the district archives, where expired policies and drafts that had never been approved were stored together in cardboard boxes arranged by year. The archive clerk handed her a plastic chair and told her to make herself comfortable, saying no one had come down there in a long time. It took her 2 afternoons. On the second afternoon, inside a box labeled with a year so old that the writing had nearly faded away, she pulled out a thin packet only a few pages long, typed on a typewriter and yellowed around the edges. The title on the first page read, "Proposal to expand family leave provisions for instructional personnel without permanent status." Clara sat still. She turned to page 2, then page 3, and found the very arguments she had spent several nights writing, expressed in different words but arranged in the same order, framing the problem in almost exactly the same way. The person who had written it had even thought of something Clara hadn't yet considered, a system for assigning substitute teachers across clusters of schools to reduce costs. At the bottom of the final page was a signature section, and there, clearly typed, was a name and a title. The name was M. Pike. The title was Contract Teacher, Fox Point Elementary School. Beneath it, attached with a rusted staple, was the district finance office's response from that year, exactly 1 paragraph long, stating that the proposal had no corresponding budget source for substitute teacher expenses, and therefore did not qualify to be presented to the board. There wasn't a single sentence saying the proposal was wrong. It only said there was no money. Clara took the packet home. She sat with it at the kitchen table until morning, and couldn't add another word to her own draft. She thought about the attendance ledger that had been opened to exactly the right page, without anyone needing to search for it. She thought about the sentence about arithmetic. She thought about the woman who had remained standing by the window. Clara didn't go looking for Marlene Pike. She placed the packet inside the pale blue cardboard box, the place where she kept the things she didn't yet know what to do with. Delia Marchetti was the teachers' union coordinator, and she received Clara in a room with 3 filing cabinets and a small desk fan. She took the draft and didn't skim it. She read it from beginning to end, with a pencil in her hand, and she crossed things out. She crossed out so much that Clara had to look away. When she reached the final page, she set down the pencil and said, "You wrote this like a farewell letter." She said boards don't read farewell letters. They read budgets. She said you spent 8 years preparing individualized education plans, so you know how to write a document that can't be rejected for emotional reasons. Write it that way. Don't ask them to feel sorry for you. Make it easy for them to say yes. Clara asked which parts needed to go. Delia flipped back through the pages and pointed to a paragraph in the middle, the one where Clara had written that an applicant should provide medical documentation proving the condition of the family member. She said this goes completely, and it goes now. Clara said, but there has to be some form of verification. Delia said yes, proof of presence is enough. She said a hospital document showing that the person was there at that time, paperwork from a funeral home, a police report. All of those things can verify the situation without forcing someone to put their mother's diagnosis on a desk. She said if you design a process that makes people do that, then you're building a door you wouldn't want to walk through yourself. She said grief is not something people should have to submit for review. Clara wrote that sentence down. Delia asked 3 more questions. Who would receive the request first? How would notification work if the emergency happened too close to the start of class? Where would the money come from to pay the substitute teacher? Clara could answer 2 of them. She couldn't answer the third. Delia said, good. You know what you don't know, and that can still be fixed. At the end of the meeting, after Clara had put her papers back into her bag and stood up, Delia called her back. She said there is one more thing, and this is more important than everything I just crossed out. She said, let the union sponsor this proposal under its own name. Clara said, but I wrote it. Delia said, exactly, and that's the problem. She said if the day comes when someone wants to kill this proposal, they won't argue with every line. They'll kill you first, and when you die, it dies with you. She looked directly at Clara and said, don't let you and the proposal stand in the same place. The check came back one evening, not through anyone's hands, but sitting in the mailbox downstairs, inside a plain white envelope with nothing written on it. The entire row of buildings had lost power around 9 o'clock that night, and Clara sat at the kitchen table with the light from her phone tilted into a cup. She opened the envelope. The amount was still the amount he had changed it to that day. She looked at it for a long time, then pulled the check closer, picked up a pen, and turned it over to the endorsement line on the back. She brought the tip of the pen to the line, and the nib touched the paper. Then she stopped, not because of pride. She stopped because she had just noticed the color of the ink. It was red. She was holding the red grading pen that still lived in the inside pocket of her bag beside the stack of assignments she had carried home from the last day she had stood in a classroom and had never found anyone to return them to. Clara looked at the tiny red mark she had just left on the check. She set the pen down. There were still papers to grade tomorrow. She folded the check, slipped it back into the envelope, and set it at the edge of the table. The following morning, Delia Marchetti called her into the union office earlier than their scheduled meeting. She didn't say hello. She placed a photocopied packet on the desk. The meeting materials the union received under policy because it had representation on the board. She turned to a marked page and rotated it so Clara could read it. It was a 4-page document from the school opposing consideration of the proposal by the board, and the signature at the bottom belonged to Vice Principal Marlene Pike. In the section explaining the reasons, one line stated that the school had become aware of pressure from an unidentified outside party connected to the individual case being discussed, and that the school considered review under those circumstances inappropriate. Delia turned another page. It was an intake record from the district's External Affairs Office, documenting an offer to fund the inclusion classroom program. A large amount of money, with no organization named by the donor, and one sentence in the record stated that the proposing party had mentioned hoping the district would reconsider the case of Clara Whitmore. Delia tapped a finger against the page and asked, "Who do you know with that kind of money?" Clara didn't answer. She stood up and walked out. Rocca and Sons headquarters sat directly on the harbor, and the receptionist told her she needed an appointment. Clara said, "I don't have one." She sat down on the floor in the middle of the lobby and said, "I'll sit here until he agrees to see me." A security guard started toward her, then stopped. About half an hour later, Bruno Salvi came downstairs, looked at her, and said, "Please come with me." Milo stood when she entered the office. He invited her to sit. She remained standing. She said, "Do you know what she submitted to the board yesterday?" 4 pages. 4 pages to stop my proposal. And the reason she gave was outside pressure. Milo said, "I didn't call anyone at the school district." Clara said, "I know." Then she said, "And that's the frightening thing about you. You don't have to call anyone. You only have to think of something. And somewhere, someone makes it happen. And no one asks you a single question. And when everything goes wrong, there isn't even anyone left to point at." She said, "You're not a man. You're weather. Wherever you pass, somebody has to clean up afterward." Milo said, "I'm trying to help you." He said it louder than he intended, and he knew it the instant the words were out. Clara said no. She said, "You're paying a debt. Helping is asking me what I need. Paying a debt is deciding for me and then handing me the bill." She placed the envelope containing the check on his desk. She said, "I'm not taking this, but I still owe the hospital bills, and I'm not going to pretend I don't." She said, "I'll borrow the money from you." Milo said, "I don't lend money." Clara said, "Then today you'll do something for the first time." She took 2 typed pages from her bag, pages she had prepared that morning, placed them on the desk, and turned them toward him. It was a promissory note stating the amount clearly, identifying Clara Whitmore as the borrower and Emiliano Rocca as the lender, with 0 interest, monthly payments, no specific deadline, but a commitment to repay the full amount. She said, "Sign here." Milo looked at the paper for a very long time. He said, "You understand that I will never ask you for a single cent, don't you?" Clara said, "I understand." Then she said, "But I need it to exist." Milo picked up the pen and signed both copies, then pushed one toward her. Clara folded her copy, slipped it into her pocket, and walked out. He remained seated, looking at the other copy lying on the desk, and he didn't put it away. The invitation to lunch came through his secretary, polite, with the time and the name of the restaurant clearly stated, and the person inviting her was Warren Kessel, a member of the school board. Clara arrived 10 minutes early and waited. He came exactly on time, shook her hand, ordered for both of them after asking what she could eat, and said nothing about the proposal through the entire first half of the meal. He asked about the inclusion classroom. He asked specific questions, the right questions, about grouping students according to how quickly they processed information, about coordinating with parents, and Clara realized he wasn't asking merely to make conversation. He understood the work. It wasn't until the server cleared their plates that he placed his hands on the table and said, "I have something I want to offer you." He said the district was preparing to create a new position, coordinator of inclusion programs for a cluster of schools on the west side of the city. He said the position would have its own budget, authority to hire teachers, authority to redesign the curriculum across the entire cluster, and that whoever sat in that chair would decide how hundreds of children were taught for years to come. He said, I have enough votes to put you in that position. Clara sat still. He continued without hurrying. He said in exchange, you withdraw the other proposal. He said, I'm not asking you to say it was wrong. Withdraw it for personal reasons. No one will ask anything. Clara asked why he wanted it gone. Kessel said because it cost money, and substitute teacher pay had to come from somewhere, and that somewhere was the program budget. Then he said something Clara would remember for a very long time afterward. He said, do you want to help children? Or do you want to win a vote? He said, I'm offering you hundreds of children. Real children. Beginning next month. That other proposal, even if it passes, at best, it gives 1/3 of the contract teachers in this district the right to bury a parent without losing their jobs. He said, choose. Clara didn't answer. She looked down at the napkin resting in her lap. She thought about the boy tapping rhythm on the tabletop. She thought about sitting in a room where people decided curriculum, about being able to speak and have people listen, about hiring people who knew what they were doing, about returning to the work she had spent 8 years learning how to do, and had lost through an email with an ordinary subject line. She thought that if she accepted, children would benefit as soon as tomorrow, while if she refused, perhaps no one would benefit at all, and she would lose both things. She sat that way for a long time, long enough that the server passed twice and didn't dare ask whether they needed anything. Then she said, I'm not withdrawing it. Kessel nodded without showing any reaction. He asked for the check, paid, stood, and before leaving he said, I respect your answer. Then he said, I only want you to understand that at that board table, people don't vote for stories. They vote for numbers, and I'm the one who provides the numbers. Then he left. Clara walked out to the parking lot, sat behind the wheel, put the key into the ignition, and didn't start the engine. She remained in the car for a very long time with her hand still resting on the key. It rained that night, and her shift ended close to dawn. When she walked through the warehouse gate, she saw him standing beneath the metal roof of the security booth, alone, with no car, and no one beside him. Milo said, I've been standing here since 2 o'clock. Clara asked, what do you want? He said, I came to answer the question you asked me the first day. Then he told her. He told her what he really did for a living. Told her about the harbor, about the things that had passed through that harbor for many years, about the thing his father had left him before he was old enough to receive it, and that he had taken anyway. He told her the parts he wasn't proud of, too. Told her about the people who had been forced to leave the city because of a decision he made. Told her about the afternoon when 3 sheets of paper had been placed on a table. He didn't explain. He didn't justify himself. He never said anything like I had no choice. When he finished, he stood quietly beneath the sound of rain striking the metal roof. Then he said, now you know. He said, tell me to leave. Clara looked at him. She had thought she would be afraid. She stood there and waited for that feeling to come, and it didn't. She said, I'm not afraid of you. Milo said you should be. Clara shook her head. She said, I feel sorry for you. He asked what for. She said, because you've lived your entire life without anyone ever giving you something for nothing. She said it, pulled up the hood of her coat, and stepped out into the rain. Milo remained beneath the metal roof without calling after her, and he stood there until her figure disappeared at the end of the street. Naomi Frank called one afternoon and said, I found the nurse. She said Odette had left St. Bede a few days after the funeral because her own mother had suffered a stroke and she had moved back to Ohio, and Naomi had needed 3 different people before she could get the number. Naomi said, Odette told me she has been waiting. Odette Ramsey flew back that weekend, and the 2 women met at a coffee shop near the bus station, where Odette was waiting for her return trip that evening. She didn't circle around the subject. She placed an old phone on the table, the kind that had been outdated for years, and said, this is mine. I kept it only because there is 1 file on it. Then she told Clara what had happened. She said a few weeks before Eileen died, she had called Odette over and asked her to do something. She said, if there ever comes a day when my girl calls and I can't answer her anymore, press record for me. Odette said, I asked her what for, and she told me just keep it, and when the time comes, give it to her. Then she gave me 1 more instruction, and this is the part I remember most clearly. She said, don't give it to my girl at the funeral, because she won't be able to hear it there. Wait until she starts punishing herself, then give it to her. Odette said, I came to the funeral that day. She said, I stood at the back and watched you through the entire service, and you kept your back straight from beginning to end. You didn't shed a single tear. You even went around shaking everyone's hand and thanking them for coming. She said at the time I thought it wasn't the right moment yet. Then my mother became ill and I had to leave. And every month after that I thought, maybe I should just mail it to you and be done with it. But I never did. She pushed the phone toward Clara and asked, "Do you want me to play it? Or would you rather listen alone?" Clara said, "Play it." Odette opened the file and placed the phone between them on the table. The recording began with noise, the sound of someone pushing a cart down the hallway, the steady beeping of a machine. Then came a faint rustling, as another phone was placed against Eileen's ear. Then Clara's voice came through, distorted by the connection but clear. And Clara listened to herself saying, "Mom, it's me. I'm on my way." She listened to herself say, "I'm sorry. I got held up. Something happened in the street, and I couldn't leave." She listened to herself say, "Wait for me just a little longer." She listened to herself say, "I love you." Then came the sound of the call ending. One small click. After that there was silence. A long silence, long enough for Clara to look up at Odette. And Odette only shook her head gently, telling her without words to keep listening. In that silence there was only the sound of the machine and the breathing of someone very close to the microphone. Then there was another sound. It was so faint that the first time Clara thought it was fabric brushing against something. Odette reached over, turned the volume all the way up, and played that part again. This time they could hear it. 3 words, spoken very slowly, separated by 2 breaths, coming from a woman who had not responded to anything for hours before that. "I heard you." The recording continued for a little while longer, then stopped. Odette reached over and turned off the phone. She said, "I have carried this in my pocket every day since then." She said, "Some days I thought maybe I had been wrong. Maybe I was being selfish. Maybe I should have given it to you much sooner." Then she looked at Clara and said, "But looking at you now, I know she was right." Clara sat without moving, both hands resting on the table, her eyes lowered toward the old phone lying between them. She didn't say anything at all. Clara went to Marlene Pike's house on Thursday evening without calling first. Marlene opened the door, looked at her, then stepped back to let her in, without asking a single question. Clara sat down at the dining table and took 3 things from her bag, placing them on the table one at a time. The first was the promissory note, bearing 2 signatures. The second was a bank statement with the monthly payments she had transferred, marked clearly from the day the agreement was signed. The third was her pay statement from the night shift at the sorting warehouse. She said, "I didn't come here to apologize, and I didn't come to ask you to withdraw that document. I came so you could see these." Marlene read each one. She read for a long time, and when she reached the pay statement, she looked up. She said, "You could take that money and disappear from this city. Pay off everything you owe, move to another state, teach somewhere else. No one would blame you for a single thing." Clara said, "I know." Marlene asked, "Then why don't you?" Clara sat quietly for a moment, then said, "Because if I did, then the person who hit that girl and drove away, and I would be alike, in exactly one way. We would both have stopped to calculate how much it would cost us to stay." Marlene said nothing. Clara opened her bag again and took out a 4th item, placing it in the middle of the table. It was the thin packet of yellowed typewritten pages, and the name on the final page was M. Pike, contract teacher, Fox Point Elementary School. Marlene looked down. She reached out and touched the edge of the paper, then drew her hand back. She didn't pick it up. That same week, on the other side of the city, Ottavio Bacci invited Milo to dinner and had the restaurant close early. He finished everything on his plate before he began talking. He said, "Sign 2 docs over to me, and the lawsuit disappears tomorrow. As for the federal people, they're hunting me, not you. I can arrange for them to keep looking in the wrong direction a little longer." Milo asked, "What about my sister?" Ottavio said that was an accident. Milo said, "You just lied to me with olive oil still on your mouth." Ottavio laughed without taking offense and said, "Your father would sign, and you know it." He said, "People don't sit at this table to preserve principles. They sit here to preserve whatever they have left." Milo stood, thanked him for dinner, and walked out without signing anything. 3 hours later, close to midnight, a city news site published an article. The headline said that a teacher whose contract had been terminated and who was now campaigning to change school district policy had accepted a large sum of money from a family under federal investigation. The article included a photograph of Milo leaving the Rocca and Sons building, and it included a photograph of a document clear enough to read every word, the promissory note bearing Clara Whitmore's name and Emiliano Rocca's signature, the very paper she had forced him to sign so she could preserve one final thing that still belonged to her. The company's accounting office had recorded the note in its books as an account receivable. The civil lawsuit had given the Bacci lawyers access to the expense records, and Kessel Staffing had long been a personnel client of a fund in which the Bacci family had held an ownership interest for years. Clara's phone began vibrating close to 1 o'clock in the morning and didn't stop. Delia called first. She didn't say hello. She said withdraw it. She said, ask for a 6-month postponement. Say it is for personal reasons. No one can challenge that. And next cycle we start again from the beginning. Clara said the meeting is in 3 days. Delia said exactly. And if you walk into that room the day after tomorrow, you won't only lose for yourself. You'll drag every person who signed their name onto this down with you. She asked, do you know how many people signed? Clara said, I know. Delia said, then think about it, and ended the call. Milo called about 10 minutes later. He said, I know who leaked it. He said, let me deal with the newspaper. By tomorrow morning, that article will be gone, and I can do this without anyone getting hurt. Clara said no. He said, listen to me. She said no, and then added that if you touch this, when I stand in front of that board the day after tomorrow, I won't know whether there is anything left in my hands that is still mine. Milo was silent on the other end of the line. Then he asked, what are you going to do? Clara sat at the kitchen table with the only lamp in the apartment still burning, the packet of documents open in front of her, the red pen lying beside it. She said, I don't know yet. The morning before the hearing, Milo Rocca walked into the federal building downtown carrying a briefcase himself. Inside were the things his father had kept for years and called insurance, shipping manifests, delivery receipts, transfer orders from shell companies, everything that had passed through the Rocca family's harbor operations over 2 decades, and all of it carried the traces of another name. He knew exactly what handing over those papers meant. It meant losing the docks, losing the company, losing the name people in this city still lowered their voices when they spoke, and spending the rest of his life under an agreement he would never be allowed to discuss. Bruno Salvi went with him, and Bruno was the only person who did. On the steps, he stopped for 1 second and said, your father would say you just threw away the whole family for a woman. Milo said no. He said, because a woman sat on the pavement with my sister and asked for nothing, and I still don't understand what that feels like. So I'm trying. He didn't call Clara. He didn't send her a message. The school board meeting room the following afternoon was more crowded than usual because several reporters were sitting in the back row. When her turn came, Clara stood, and she didn't wait for anyone to ask a question. She held up a printed copy of the article and read the headline aloud, all of it, without leaving out a single word. Then she set the page down and said the article is true. She said money was paid. I signed a promissory note. I have repaid part of it, and I will repay the rest. She placed the bank statement on the secretary's table. She said, I didn't come here to prove that I am clean. She said, I came here to say that if you only approve proposals written by people with spotless lives, then you will be waiting a very long time, because people usually begin thinking about emergency leave policies only after they have already lost someone. Then she did the thing no one in the room expected. She opened the packet, turned to the first page, and said, I am asking that my name be removed from this document. She said, if my name stains it, then cross my name out. She said, it doesn't need me. It only needs to be right. Delia Marchetti stood and confirmed that the teachers' union had already formally sponsored the proposal, and that the document remained procedurally valid, whether the original writer kept her name on it or not. Warren Kessel said nothing. He sat up straighter, then settled back again, and the notes in front of him were never opened after that. The board chair asked whether anyone else wished to speak. Marlene Pike raised her hand. She said 2 years earlier, a teacher had told her that her grandmother had died, and 3 weeks later Marlene had seen photographs of that teacher at the beach. She gave another example, more briefly. Then she said that morning, when Miss Whitmore stood in the doorway of my office, I heard 2 old voices speaking. She said I didn't hear her. She didn't apologize. She only said the sentence I said to you that day was unnecessary. Then she proposed adding a clause, and she read it from a handwritten sheet, stating that when an absence results from assisting a person in distress, the reviewing authority must consider whether remaining at the scene was reasonably necessary, rather than deciding solely on whether other people were present. The secretary recorded the wording exactly. At that moment, the door at the back of the room opened. Naomi Frank came in with parents and students from the inclusion class, the children having just finished school, one of them still holding a small box of pastries. Naomi said this was their idea, not the adults. The children didn't say anything. As a group, they raised their hands and made a greeting sign. Some did it more slowly than the others. One used the wrong hand and corrected it, and one began to giggle after making a mistake. The room was completely silent. Clara turned her face away. When it came time to vote, Warren Kessel said, I abstain. The previous morning, federal investigators had arrived at the headquarters of the parent company of Kessel Staffing. The board voted on 2 matters. The first, whether to reconsider the termination of Clara Whitmore's contract, failed because the school's decision had been valid under the policy in effect at the time. The second, whether to adopt a 1-year pilot compassionate leave policy for instructional personnel without permanent status, passed. No one applauded. The board chair tapped a pen against the table once and moved on to the next item on the agenda. 2 weeks after the hearing, Clara went to Rocca and Sons headquarters and found a for sale sign taped to the glass in the lobby, printed in large letters with the phone number of a brokerage office beneath it. Bruno Salvi came to open the door for her, and standing there in the middle of that empty lobby, he told her what had happened, because Milo had given him instructions beforehand that if the day ever came when she showed up asking, he could tell her, but he was not to go looking for her just to tell her. Bruno told her about the morning at the Federal Building, briefly, without adding anything. Then he said there was one more thing. He said the last house that had belonged to Milo's father had been sold too, sold the previous month, and every dollar from it had been transferred into the Teachers Union Emergency Assistance Fund, anonymously, with no name, no thank you letter, not a single line. Clara asked whether Delia knew. Bruno said she did. Clara stood still. Delia had known, and she hadn't said anything. Julia came to see her one afternoon, walking on her own, without crutches. She handed Clara a small paper package. Inside was the linen handkerchief. The tear had been repaired, but not in a way meant to make it look whole again. It had been stitched with gold thread that stood clearly against the fabric, running along the torn line like a scar someone had deliberately chosen to leave visible. Julia said, "I didn't hide the tear. I thought you wouldn't like that." In the corner of the handkerchief, the white embroidered stitches forming the letter were still intact. Julia said, "I changed my field. I'm studying music education now." She said, "I teach children how to feel rhythm through the vibrations in a wooden floor. You put your feet down and you can tell." Then she said, "My wrist can't handle 4 hours a day anymore, but it can still rest on a child's shoulder, and there is one kid in my class who can count rhythm better than I can." Milo came one weekend morning and stood outside the warehouse gate holding 2 paper cups of coffee. No car, no one with him. He said nothing about the things he had done, and Clara didn't ask. He invited her to eat. The place he took her was a small noodle shop on a street corner, the kind of place where the line stretched all the way onto the sidewalk, and he stood at the back with everyone else, hands in his pockets, waiting his turn. Clara watched him standing there among people who had no idea who he was. She said, "You know, this is the first time I have ever seen you have to wait." And he laughed. It was the first time in this entire story that he laughed. One afternoon, sometime later, Clara stood waiting for a bus at the intersection on Atwells Avenue. An older man walking along the sidewalk suddenly collapsed. Her body reacted before her mind did, and she took 2 steps toward him before stopping. 3 people were already there. One knelt beside him, kept him still, and asked his name. Another called emergency services, and gave the street number clearly, slowly, twice. The third held out a hand and told everyone else to step back and give him room to breathe. Not one person raised a phone to record. Clara remained behind them, and no one knew who she was, and no one needed her. The bus arrived. She got on. Not every act of kindness is repaid, and Clara would never get back the final morning she could have spent beside her mother. But kindness should never cost so much that only people with money can afford to offer it. When a society forces decent people to destroy themselves in order to prove they are decent, the fault doesn't belong to the person who stopped. The fault belongs to the road, and real power is not the ability to buy someone's debt. It is the ability to stand still, to ask first, to respect another person's choice, even when you have more than enough power to do the opposite. Some people change the world by leaving their names behind. Others change it by leaving a door where there used to be nothing but a wall. If Clara's story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this video so we can continue bringing you meaningful stories every day. How do you feel about Clara's choice? And if you had been there that morning, what would you have done? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below, because we truly want to hear what comes from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.